It started with a quiet decision, one that would unravel more than a decade's worth of belief in a single afternoon. Elijah Monroe sat in his car just before 10 a.m., parked near the corner of a bustling shopping plaza in Memphis, Tennessee. The air outside shimmered with early southern heat, the kind that clung to your skin before you even stepped into the sun. Inside his car, the air was still, heavy with thought. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, not quite recognizing the man who looked back. No suit, no polished cufflinks or silk tie, just a faded navy hoodie, a pair of dark jeans, and a cap pulled low over his brow. To the world, he looked like any other middle-aged black man running errands on a Saturday morning. And that was exactly the point. Elijah Monroe wasn't just any man. He was the founder and CEO of Monrovia Living, a booming home and lifestyle retail empire with locations across the southern U.S. The store he now watched from a distance had once been a symbol of risk and vision. It was one of his earliest expansions, a Memphis outpost launched on faith and fire, back when every new lease felt like a cliff edge, but something had shifted. Over the last several months, anonymous emails and complaints had trickled into corporate headquarters. Disrespect, dismissiveness, uneven treatment. Elijah's team brushed it off as noise. Probably just bad days, someone had said. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling. So he decided to see for himself, not as the CEO, but as a nobody. No entourage, no advance notice. Just a silent observer stepping into the world he built to test the roots of his empire with his own 2 feet. As he stepped out of his car, the sun hit him full in the face. He slung a worn canvas bag over his shoulder and walked toward the automatic doors like a man with nothing to prove and everything to learn. He didn't expect what happened next to shake him to his core. The inside of the store was brightly lit, pristine in layout. Promotional signs hung above curated aisles of decor, cookware, and tech gadgets. At first glance, everything looked right, organized, efficient. But Elijah knew better than to trust the surface. His eyes moved slowly, absorbing everything. The employee interactions, the customer expressions, the invisible pulse of the space. Near the back wall, a young man in his early 20s leaned lazily against the electronics counter, scrolling through his phone. His posture was relaxed in that specific way that signaled indifference, not ease. Elijah made his way toward him. He passed rows of Bluetooth speakers and smart home devices until he stopped near a pair of mid-range headphones. He picked them up, examined the packaging, gave it a small tilt in the light. It wasn't about the headphones. It was about the moment. Would the employee notice, engage, offer help? Nothing. Not a glance. Not a word. Elijah waited. Still nothing. So he moved closer, lifting a box of outdoor Bluetooth speakers and placing them on the counter with a soft thud. This time, the young man finally looked up, eyes half-lidded with disinterest. "Can I help you?" the man asked flatly, the words falling out of his mouth like they were an inconvenience. Elijah forced a polite smile. "I was just wondering, are these good for outdoor use?" The employee shrugged and glanced at the box for a half-second. "I don't know. Probably." Elijah blinked. "Could you check for sure?" A sigh. Audible. Performative. The man grabbed the box, read a single line of text, and mumbled, "It says weatherproof." "That's helpful. Are they compatible with most devices?" This time, the man didn't even pretend to look. "Look, man," he said, tone tightening. "It's all right there on the box. You can read it like everyone else." He turned his attention back to his phone without waiting for a reply. And just like that, a silence heavier than steel settled between them. Elijah stood there, motionless. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew exactly what this moment was. It wasn't just a rude encounter. It was something deeper. It was dismissal, assumption, disrespect, not just of a customer, but of what he represented. He took a slow breath, setting the box back on the shelf. This was why he came. Not just to witness gaps in service, but to stare directly into the face of something he had hoped never existed inside his company. He wandered through the store's sections in a daze, watching staff interact with other customers. An older white couple was being helped with smiles and patience. A young mother got personal shopping advice near the candles. Meanwhile, Elijah faded into the background. He became invisible, until he overheard something that turned his simmering disappointment into something closer to heartbreak. Two employees, both young, both leaned casually against a shelving unit, were talking quietly, unaware that their words carried farther than they thought. "That dude in electronics? He's been there like 10 minutes, probably not buying anything. Just browsing," one said. The other laughed under his breath. "You already know. He doesn't look like he can afford any of this." Elijah froze. He didn't confront them. He didn't even flinch. But deep inside, something shattered. It wasn't just the words, it was the ease with which they were said. Like this kind of prejudice was routine, casual, harmless. Except it wasn't. Because the man they were referring to was the one who signed their paychecks. But more than that, he was a black man who had built his business on the belief that dignity was universal. And right now, he felt like he was standing on the fault line of his own legacy. Elijah didn't leave. Not yet. He wanted to see it through. He made his way to the checkout line, where a middle-aged black woman with a calm smile scanned items and greeted customers with warm precision. Her name tag read, Tasha. When Elijah stepped up, she looked him in the eye and said with a sincerity that felt like an anchor, "Good morning, sir. Did you find everything okay today?" Elijah paused. "Not exactly," he replied. Tasha's smile softened. "Well, if you need anything else, we're right here." For a brief moment, her kindness eased the weight pressing down on his shoulders, but the damage was done. As he walked out of the store, the air felt heavier. The storefront, once a symbol of progress and pride, now stood as a quiet question mark. What had happened? How had something he built with so much intention turned into a space where bias could breathe freely? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Elijah Monroe didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the streets of Memphis, the afternoon sun casting long streaks of gold across the windshield, as his thoughts whirled louder than the engine beneath him. The radio remained off. The silence gave space for the questions he didn't want to ask. Questions that had been forming for months, but had now exploded into something undeniable. How had he missed this? How had something so fundamentally wrong festered inside his business, his legacy, without his knowing? By the time he parked again, the sun was already dipping behind the skyline. He was outside a small park he hadn't visited in years, a place he used to come when Monrovia living was still just a dream on paper. It had been his thinking space, his breathing room. Now, it was where he would process what came next. He sat on a bench near the water, the breeze brushing against his hoodie as memories flooded back. Long nights spent planning inventory logistics, writing mission statements that emphasized people over profit, training early hires with the mantra, "We're not just selling products, we're building relationships." Somewhere along the way, that mission had blurred. Delegation had become necessity. Regional managers, mid-level executives, HR policies, they were all supposed to scale the culture. But culture wasn't scalable if it wasn't constantly nurtured. That realization hit him harder than any disrespectful employee could. He pulled out the small notebook he always kept tucked in the side pocket of his bag. Inside, the pages were filled with fragments of ideas, notes from past board meetings, scribbled reflections from late-night flights, to-do lists he never quite finished. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote at the top in bold letters, "Culture audit, start here." It wasn't enough to feel shocked, or even betrayed. He needed to act. But that action couldn't be reactionary. It had to be informed, grounded, strategic, and most importantly, human. Elijah started jotting down the differences he'd observed that day. The warmth of Tasha versus the coldness of the electronics associate, the bias-laced remarks in home goods, the lack of consistency. He wasn't building a case against a single store. He was building a mirror. One he intended to hold up to the entire organization. Still, for every note of disappointment, he added one of hope. The kind Latina employee who greeted an elderly man with compassion. the subtle nod of a cashier treating each customer with patience. These weren't just exceptions. They were reminders that the original vision of Monrovia living hadn't vanished. It had just been buried under layers of unchecked habits. By nightfall, Elijah made a decision. He would return. Not as a CEO in disguise, and not to make a scene, but to confront the reality, directly and respectfully. It was time to speak truth in the place that had forgotten it. The next morning, he arrived early, before the store even opened. This time, he wore a blazer. Nothing flashy, just enough to reintroduce himself not with authority, but with clarity. At 9:45 a.m., he walked through the doors with quiet purpose and asked to speak to the store manager. The woman at the front register, a petite brunette with a nervous smile, paged someone on the overhead system. Minutes later, a man emerged from the back office. Mid-40s, button-down shirt slightly wrinkled, holding a clipboard. "Morning, I'm Greg, store manager. How can I help?" He froze mid-sentence, recognition blooming across his face. "Mr. Monroe?" Elijah extended a hand, calm but firm. "Yes. Thank you for meeting me." Greg shook his hand, clearly rattled. We didn't know you were coming. I would have had the team prepare." "That's the point," Elijah said gently. "I needed to see this place unfiltered." They sat down in the small break room behind the customer service desk. The smell of old coffee lingered in the air, and laminated posters of company values lined the walls. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He shared. He told Greg about the treatment he'd received, about the dismissive tone, the assumptions, the words spoken by two employees who didn't know they were speaking about the man who signed their checks. And perhaps most importantly, the feeling he left with, that this wasn't an isolated misstep, but a cultural crack in the foundation. Greg listened, his face shifting between shock, guilt, and reflection. "I knew we had some inconsistencies," he admitted quietly, "but I didn't realize it was this deep. I'm embarrassed." Elijah nodded. "I don't want embarrassment. I want accountability. And that starts with us, not just the frontline staff, but with leadership. That includes you. And it includes me." They sat in silence for a beat before Elijah spoke again. "I'd like to speak with the staff, today. All of them. I think it's time they meet the man behind the name." Greg hesitated, then nodded. "I'll gather them." Within the hour, nearly a dozen employees filtered into the break room. Some were visibly nervous, others curious. A few, particularly the young man from electronics, tried to look unfazed, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Elijah stood at the front of the room, notebook in hand, not above them, with them. "Good morning," he began. "My name is Elijah Monroe. I'm the founder of this company. And yesterday, I walked through this store as just another customer." A ripple of surprise moved through the group. The young man in electronics shifted in his seat. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted the truth. And I got it." He paused, letting the words settle. "Some of you were kind, thoughtful, professional. To those of you who treated me, or anyone, with dignity, I thank you. But others didn't. Some ignored me. Some made assumptions. Some spoke words I hope they now regret." His voice never rose, but the weight behind it filled every corner of the room. "This isn't about punishment," he continued. "It's about reflection. This company was built to be different, to be better. But a brand is only as strong as the people who carry it, and right now, I'm not convinced we're all carrying the same values." He opened his notebook and read a single sentence aloud. "We treat every person with dignity, no matter their background, bank account, or appearance." That's from the company mission statement, the one printed in your onboarding packets, the one on the wall you pass every day. He closed the book and looked around. If those are just words, we fail. But if we live them, really live them, we don't just succeed, we lead. For the first time, no one fidgeted. No one glanced at the clock. They were listening. Elijah stepped back, not with finality, but with invitation. Today isn't the end. It's the start of something better, but it has to start with honesty. So I'm asking you to look in the mirror and decide, who do you want to be when no one's watching? And with that, he stepped aside. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to, because something deeper had begun. A reckoning and a return. The day after Elijah Monroe's unexpected staff meeting, the energy in the store shifted, but not in the way one might expect. There was no dramatic overhaul, no thunderous applause or tearful apologies. Instead, there was a quiet tension, like the seconds after a lightning strike when everyone waits to see what catches fire. Some employees moved with noticeable caution, as though every interaction might be watched, every word judged. Others, like Denise, the seasoned cashier with the warm smile, carried on with calm professionalism, quietly proving what the company stood for without ever saying it aloud. But there was also a third group, the most dangerous kind. Those who dismissed Elijah's visit as a one-time performance, who believed, deep down, that the rules didn't really apply to them. Elijah sensed this. He could feel it in the sideways glances, in the whispered conversations that ended when he entered a room, in the absence of genuine engagement. But he didn't react. Not yet. Instead, he started showing up every day. No speeches, no clipboard, no CEO airs. He helped unload stock in the mornings, chatting casually with the warehouse crew. He greeted customers at the entrance during lunch hours, thanking them for choosing Monrovia Living with the sincerity that made some pause. In the evenings, he shadowed different departments, asking questions like a trainee instead of a boss. It wasn't surveillance, it was immersion. And through it, Elijah began to see the full anatomy of the problem. It wasn't just individual prejudice, it was learned behavior. The store's internal culture had slowly normalized disengagement. Warmth was reserved for customers who looked like they belonged. Assistance was given more freely to those who dressed a certain way, spoke a certain way, looked a certain way. The biases weren't always loud, but they were consistent, and consistency is what shapes a culture, not slogans printed on posters. One moment that crystallized this for Elijah came late one Friday afternoon. He was restocking candles in the home goods aisle when he saw an older black man, perhaps in his 70s, approach a pair of young employees for help finding an item. The man spoke gently, his voice carrying the polite cadence of someone who'd been taught not to demand too much. The employees offered a vague nod, muttered something about checking the back, then drifted off without returning. Elijah waited, watched. 10 minutes passed. The man stood patiently by the display, scanning the aisles as if still hoping someone would return. Elijah approached. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" The man looked surprised, then smiled. "I was just looking for the lavender oil diffusers. My wife likes them, but I don't see them on the shelf." Elijah nodded and led him a few aisles over, finding the product tucked behind a disorganized batch of clearance tags. The man chuckled softly when he saw it. "You'd think I was asking for gold the way those boys disappeared." Elijah didn't smile. Instead, he asked, "Has that happened to you here before?" The man paused. Then, with a shrug too heavy to be casual, said, "I'm used to it. You learn not to expect too much." That sentence stayed with Elijah long after the customer had left. You learn not to expect too much. It wasn't said in anger. It wasn't meant to provoke. But to Elijah, it was a warning. A quiet signal of resignation that no customer should ever feel, especially not in a place built on the promise of belonging. That night, Elijah drove to a local diner tucked beneath a neon sign that had been flickering since the 80s. He sat in a corner booth, ordered black coffee and a slice of pecan pie, and wrote in his notebook long into the evening. The problem, he realized, wasn't isolated to a few underperforming employees. It was systemic. Not because the company was inherently broken, but because it had outgrown its ability to self-monitor. The values he had once passed on through personal connection had been watered down by bureaucracy, by distance, by complacency. If change was going to happen, it couldn't come from the top alone. It had to rise from within. That weekend, Elijah invited Denise to join him for coffee before her shift. She looked surprised but honored by the gesture. Over steaming mugs and soft jazz in the background, He asked her what she thought was really going on. She didn't hold back. "There's good people here," she said. "People who care. But they're tired. Some feel overlooked. Others just don't know how to lead, so they stop trying. And then there's a few who just shouldn't be in customer service at all." Elijah listened. Denise continued. "Most of the ones causing problems, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. They think they're just being real. But that realness comes with bias, and no one calls it out because we're too busy or too scared." That last line struck a nerve. Too busy or too scared. It explained the silence, the resignation, the quiet nods of complicity that allowed bad behavior to survive in plain sight. Elijah made a decision that day. It was time to do more than observe. The next week, he called for a series of listening sessions. Voluntary, off the clock, with snacks and open invitations. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He didn't bring a corporate facilitator. Just a circle of chairs, a flip pad, and one rule. Speak your truth. No punishments. No filters. And speak they did. Some shared stories of mistreatment from fellow employees. Others talked about customers who had treated them with condescension or worse. A few admitted they didn't feel equipped to handle bias, either in others or within themselves. One young man, quiet until now, finally said, "I think I was taught to ignore people like me. So when someone like you walked in wearing sweats and looking regular, I didn't know how to see you as important." It was a painful admission, but it was honest. And honesty is where change begins. Elijah closed that session with a statement, not a speech. This company isn't just a business. It's a reflection of us. So if we want it to get better, we have to get better. Not perfect. Just braver. Just more aware. And we start right here. He didn't expect applause. He got something better. Nods. Reflection. And for the first time, a real sense that people were listening not because they had to, but because they finally understood why it mattered. The road ahead would still be long. But for the first time in weeks, Elijah didn't feel like he was walking it alone. The ripple effect of the listening sessions began to stretch far beyond what Elijah Monroe had initially imagined. What started as quiet, vulnerable circles of honesty quickly evolved into something more dynamic, an awakening. For the first time in a long while, people at the Arlington store began to feel seen. Not by a spreadsheet, not by a metric, but by each other. But with honesty came discomfort. Not everyone embraced the process with open arms. Some employees, especially those who had grown used to the status quo, felt threatened by the changes. Elijah could feel the resistance, mostly in silence, in stares that lasted too long, in hushed words cut short when he passed by. One of the assistant supervisors, a man named Tyler who had been at the store for 6 years, openly questioned the point of all this talking. In the break room, he'd mutter things like, "Why fix what's not broken?" and "This place doesn't need therapy, it needs better customers." Elijah didn't respond. He listened. Because he knew the resistance was part of the process. He had seen it before. In boardrooms, in community centers, even in himself. Change doesn't come without friction. The key wasn't to silence it. The key was to understand where it came from, and then help people move through it. So Elijah kept showing up. He continued to walk the floor. Not as surveillance, but as a steady presence. He asked better questions. What makes your job harder than it needs to be? What do you wish leadership really understood? What makes you proud to work here? And what makes you quiet about it? It wasn't about collecting complaints. It was about collecting truths. In one particularly telling conversation, Elijah sat with a younger employee named Jordan, a tall, soft-spoken man who mostly worked night shifts in inventory. Jordan had kept his distance during earlier discussions, but finally agreed to chat over coffee during one of Elijah's evening visits. "I don't think I belong in customer service," Jordan admitted, eyes low. "Why do you feel that way?" Elijah asked. Jordan shrugged. "Because I don't talk the right way. I'm awkward. I'm not that smile and make everyone feel special type. Some of the managers make me feel like I'm just lucky to have a job." Elijah sat back in his chair. "What do you think your strength is?" Jordan thought for a moment. "I notice things. Patterns. I can walk into a room and tell you which display's off balance. I can tell you which customers are getting frustrated, even if no one else sees it. Elijah nodded. That sounds like someone who sees more than they say. That's a kind of leadership. Jordan looked at him, surprised. No one's ever said that before. Maybe no one was paying attention, Elijah said. That conversation led to Jordan being invited into a pilot training program Elijah was quietly building. An initiative to grow leadership from within the store, based not on charisma, but on capacity and compassion. Elijah believed that the best way to shift culture was to empower those who already lived in the heart of it. But they needed to be seen, elevated, and trusted. Behind the scenes, Elijah began restructuring the training modules used for new hires. He worked with Denise and 2 other employees, an assistant floor manager named Michelle and a frontline worker named Luis, to reframe how bias, empathy, and ownership were taught. Instead of using corporate jargon, they created role plays from real experiences. They invited employees to design parts of the training themselves, giving them a personal stake in the store's future. And then, something happened that brought it all into focus. A new hire, a young black woman named Alana, started her first day working the floor. Nervous but eager, she was assigned to shadow a more senior associate named Greg, someone who had been lukewarm in his responses during the recent staff meetings. Within an hour, Elijah, observing discreetly from the seasonal aisle, noticed a familiar pattern. Greg barely spoke to her. He gave her curt instructions, avoided eye contact, and at one point, even left her standing in front of a confused customer without explanation. Elijah felt a slow heat rising in his chest, but he didn't interrupt. Not yet. Later that afternoon, he pulled Alana aside in the break room. "How's your first day going?" he asked. She smiled politely, but there was a strain behind it. "It's okay, just trying to stay out of the way." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You don't have to stay out of the way. You're part of this team. If you ever feel like that's not true, I want to know." Her eyes widened a little. She nodded. That night, Elijah sat with the leadership team. They went over performance reviews, scheduling, and then Elijah paused the meeting. "I need us to talk about something real," he said. "A new hire was treated like a burden today. That's not a performance issue. That's a cultural one." The room fell quiet. "We can't teach our values once and assume they'll stick. We have to model them every day. And when someone falls short, we don't just note it. We address it, with clarity, with care, and yes, with consequences when necessary." He turned to Brian, the store manager. "Are we ready to have that kind of accountability here?" Brian nodded slowly. "We are. We have to be." From that meeting forward, leadership began conducting weekly team huddles. Not just about sales goals, but about culture, about bias, about inclusion. And slowly, stories started to change. Employees began sharing wins, times they had stepped up for each other, or gone above and beyond for a customer who didn't expect kindness. They laughed more. Disagreements still happened, but they happened out in the open, resolved in real time. Even Tyler, the skeptic, started showing up to the huddles with questions, not complaints. Elijah noticed the shift in his eyes. Less defensive, more curious. In the 4th week of this cultural rebuild, Denise approached Elijah with a folded piece of paper. "Thought you might want to see this," she said. It was a note, handwritten, unsigned. It read, "This is the first job where I feel like I matter. Thank you for showing up." Elijah held the note for a long time. He didn't know who wrote it. He didn't need to. Because that single sentence told him everything he needed to know. They were getting there. One decision. One conversation. One act of presence at a time. The store had grown quieter as the weeks passed, not from a lack of business, but from a newfound sense of balance. There was a calmness in the way the team moved now. More fluid, more present. Customers noticed it too. Reviews had taken a sharp turn toward the positive. A family wrote in to thank an associate named Luis for treating their elderly father with rare dignity. A teen girl left a glowing comment on the company's social media, sharing how Denise had helped her pick a graduation gift when no one else had time to listen. Elijah Monroe stood at the entrance of the Arlington store one crisp Friday morning, watching the staff set up for a weekend promotion. He wasn't wearing his CEO badge or holding a clipboard. He didn't need to. People saw him differently now, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. As he moved through the aisles, a quiet sense of pride crept over him. Not pride in himself, but in the people who had decided to rise to the challenge. The same young man who had once looked through Elijah as if he were invisible, Anthony, from the electronics department, was now actively engaging customers, demoing products, answering questions with interest. Elijah had watched his transformation unfold like a slow unwrapping. Not overnight, not loud, but steady. And that was the thing. Nothing meaningful ever happened all at once. He passed by Jordan, now mentoring a newer employee on visual merchandising. They were rearranging displays with purpose, speaking in low, focused tones. Jordan looked up briefly and nodded at Elijah. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just shared understanding. Elijah's next stop was the break room. The same space that once buzzed with tension now held signs of care. A handwritten note on the bulletin board read, "Appreciate each other. It shows." Below it, anonymous shoutouts filled the wall of thanks, a small project Denise had suggested during one of the weekly huddles. Elijah had smiled the day it went up, and smiled again now, seeing it covered edge to edge. But something else was on his mind. Today marked 30 days since that first visit, since he'd stepped into this building not as a CEO, but as a black man looking to see if the soul of his company still beat beneath the surface. What he had uncovered was both painful and necessary. He knew now that leadership wasn't just about vision, it was about vigilance, about returning to the root again and again to ensure it stayed alive. As noon approached, Elijah asked Brian to call for an all-staff meeting on the sales floor. There was no drama to it, no announcement of some massive change, just a final gathering to mark the beginning of something better. When the team circled up near the front of the store, Elijah waited for the quiet to settle. Then he stepped forward, holding nothing in his hands. No prepared notes, just truth. 30 days ago, he began. I walked into this store with a question, one I didn't even fully understand yet. I wanted to see if the values I built this company on still lived here. What I found, at first, shook me. He paused, scanning the group. I saw dismissiveness, I saw judgment, I saw people making assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. Several eyes lowered, but no one flinched. But I also saw something else, he continued. I saw Denise, reminding us what respect looks like. I saw Jordan, stepping into his quiet strength. I saw many of you, once skeptical, start to ask better questions. I saw you choose growth. A stillness hung in the air, not of discomfort, but reflection. I'm proud of what we've done together. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Elijah exhaled, then added, and now we begin again. There was a moment of silence, and then Denise stepped forward, smiling. Mind if I say something? Elijah nodded. She turned to the team. We all needed this wake-up call. We were slipping, whether we saw it or not. But we're not who we were 30 days ago, and we don't have to go back. The room nodded. Even Tyler. Elijah turned to Brian. You've led with humility. Thank you. Brian met his gaze. Thank you for trusting us enough to tell us the truth. Before the crowd broke up, Elijah added one final note. This store will be our pilot, but not the only one. We're taking this to every location. Culture isn't local, it's lived, and we're going to live it out loud. Applause broke, not forced, but full. That evening, as the store buzzed with customers, Elijah stood near the exit, quietly watching. He saw a young white father helping his son try on a jacket, while a black associate assisted them both with patience and ease. He saw an elderly Asian woman being walked to the restroom by a teenage employee who kept chatting with her the whole way. He saw humanity on display, in all its simple brilliance. Just as he turned to leave, a familiar voice called from behind him, Mr. Monroe? It was Anthony, the electronics associate who had once refused to help him. I just wanted to say, Anthony began, scratching the back of his neck. I didn't recognize you that day, but that's not the point. I treated you like you didn't matter. And I'm sorry. Elijah studied him for a long beat. I appreciate that. Anthony nodded. I'm working on it. I see that, Elijah said. Keep going. He stepped out into the fading light of a Texas sunset, the golden hour stretching across the parking lot like a quiet benediction. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of it all alone. He felt surrounded by people willing to do the hard work, by a team learning to rise, and most of all, by the quiet, resilient echo of his own belief. That dignity isn't a product you sell. It's a choice you make, every single day. Elijah Monroe's journey began with a simple question, one that ultimately challenged the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his company. As a successful black CEO, he could have easily stayed in the comfort of corner offices and executive suites. Instead, he chose to walk quietly into his own store disguised as an everyday shopper, armed not with authority, but with curiosity and courage. What he discovered was both jarring and necessary, a disconnect between the values he had built his business on and the culture that had been allowed to take root in his absence. What began as a silent observation quickly unfolded into a painful realization. His presence, when stripped of title and power, was met with indifference, even prejudice. It wasn't just poor service, it was the unspoken message that some people mattered less than others. But instead of reacting with outrage or retribution, Elijah chose a higher path. He listened, he watched, he endured, and then he acted, not with vengeance, but with purpose. By confronting his team face to face, not as a CEO demanding answers, but as a human being demanding accountability, Elijah reminded everyone what leadership truly looks like. He didn't just point fingers, he offered a mirror. He invited his employees to step into discomfort, to acknowledge their biases, and to grow beyond them. Through patience and perseverance, he ignited a cultural reset, one built not on fear, but on shared responsibility. The transformation wasn't instant, nor was it easy. But as Elijah returned to the store weeks later, he saw the shift firsthand. The same employees who once turned away were now leaning in. Respect became visible, in the way customers were greeted, in the way colleagues supported each other, and in the way silence was replaced with empathy. Elijah's story is a powerful reminder that the real measure of leadership isn't how you behave when people know who you are. It's how you lead when they don't. It's about holding fast to your principles even when no one's watching. And most of all, it's about recognizing that true change begins at the ground level. One conversation, one choice, one human interaction at a time. So what's the lesson we take from this? It's simple, yet profound. Dignity shouldn't depend on appearance, income, or status. Every person, regardless of who they are, deserves to be treated with basic respect. Whether you're leading a company, working on the floor, or simply navigating the world, your actions have power. Use them to lift others. Use them to challenge bias. Use them to build the world you want to live in. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that change doesn't require a title, only a choice, then help us share more stories like this. Subscribe to our channel. Be part of a community that believes in transformation through truth, compassion, and action. Because the world doesn't change when you shout the loudest. It changes when you show up with purpose. And we're just getting started.